So welcome everyone, welcome back to our seminar series, Grappling with Complexity. It's actually my honor to introduce our speaker today, Prof. Ian Buchanan. Ian is a professor of cultural studies at the University of Wollongong, Australia, and he's a world-renowned scholar of the philosophical works of Deleuze and Guattari. I think it's pretty safe to say that he actually essentially created the field of Deleuze and Guattari studies. His recent publications include two books, Assemblage Theory and Method in 2020, and The Incomplete Project of Schizoanalysis in 2021. So very happy to welcome you to our space, Ian. And yeah, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. I did in fact get down copies of these books off the shelf so that I can show you, because I'm super happy to have them in my hands. So I also must say that it is with considerable regret that I'm not actually in Port Elizabeth to present this, since I would relish practically any excuse to get on a plane and go to South Africa. I don't know if your borders are closed, but our borders are completely closed. So it sort of reached the point where I would get on a plane to go anywhere right now, since we can't even travel interstate. I can't even visit my parents. The borders are completely closed there. Okay, so I wasn't sure how long my talk should be. So I started with a very long talk, and I'm going to, on the fly, make it a much shorter talk. So the price of that may be a little bit of sort of, Burroughs type cut up, for which I apologize. But if I miss anything crucial, I'm happy to pick it up in the questions. So for me, the idea of the assemblage and the idea of assemblage theory is, I guess, one of the ways by which we can try to deal with complexity. So my view is that complexity can be understood as a problem or as a problematic, and that one of the reasons why we need a concept like this, the assemblage, is to try to think about, well, how can we deal with complexity? So I'm not really going to follow the pathway of complexity theory as such, although Deleuze and Guattari were very interested in complexity theory. Rather, I'm interested in saying, well, if we start from the position that the world is more complex than we think, then what kind of analytic methodology might we need in order to begin to analyze it? Now, the problem with this, for me, as somebody who's very interested in Deleuze and Guattari, is that the people's ways of thinking about and dealing with the concept of the assemblage have been somewhat problematic. So at least part of what I want to do is talk about some of the problems with assemblage theory, which I guess kind of assumes that you at least know something about what that concept is. So hopefully, if you don't know what that concept is, by the time I get to the examples, you will. So assemblage theory, more so than most theories, it sometimes seems, is subject to several misconceptions, which I think kind of weigh it down and stop it from being developed into a method. And one of these misconceptions is the tendency to treat the idea of the assemblage, or to treat actual assemblages, as though they are simply physical entities cobbled together from random bits of material, like a potluck dinner or a patchwork quilt. And the most sophisticated iteration of this way of thinking about the assemblage is Jane Bennett's well-known and widely endorsed definition of the assemblage as an ad hoc grouping of diverse elements of vibrant materials of all sorts. And there is a common sense quality to the idea that the assemblage is something assembled from miscellaneous things that is difficult to argue with, because the very word assemblage seems to be saying precisely that. But bear in mind, the word assemblage is not the word that Deleuze and Guattari themselves use. It is a translation. So whenever you hear people at conferences pronouncing assemblage in an exaggeratedly French way, it always sounds funny to me. The original word that Deleuze and Guattari used was agencement, which we could translate as assemblage as one way, but it could also be translated as arrangement. Some people have translated it as ensemble, which I think is problematic, and probably the most outlying translation has been to translate it as layout. In my view, it makes the most sense to think of it as an arrangement, because arrangements, if you think about arranging a meeting with somebody, an arrangement is something that is both spatial and temporal, which is a good way of thinking about the assemblage. The other problem with the word assemblage is that it has given rise to the idea that assemblages are assembled, like a Meccano set or something like that. But this is a kind of false, declension of the term, because assemblages are not assembled as such. And so there's this kind of common sense way of thinking about it that I think we need to challenge if we sort of get past it. If, as Bennett argues, assemblages are just ad hoc groupings, it is difficult to see the point of the concept, save that it names randomly formed heterogeneous entities. And it's hard to escape this conclusion, because Bennett insists that whatever agency or power, capacity or capability the assemblage might have only emerges out of the interaction between its randomly thrown together elements. So under these conditions, it can have neither intention nor purpose, which I think creates several problems for our way of trying to think about what assemblages might be. So in this sense, Bennett's model of the assemblage is a problem, and I think we need to ask why. My contention is that it's because she tries to see it as an entity, albeit a processual entity in the sort of Whitehead sense, whereas for Deleuze and Guattari, it is a dynamic arrangement between two semi-autonomous formations that encompass the organization of bodies and the organization of discourses. So the real origin of the concept of the assemblage, insofar as we're diving deep into Deleuze and Guattari's work, comes from the book The Logic of Sense, and specifically their way of working through the Stoic idea around the notion of meaning and the relationship between the body and its attributes. And they take this up through the work of Hjelmslev later on, but fundamentally there's a kind of binary at work here between the body and its attributes, or as we come to think about it, as the formations of discourse and formations of bodies. So Bennett's project is to use the notion of the assemblage to show, and I'm quoting here, limitations in human-centered theories of action, and demonstrate that the extent to which contemporary society is populated by institutions and systems that bridge the human and non-human divide. And this is clearly one implication of Deleuze and Guattari's work, for example, the concept of the man-horse assemblage that they talk about. But Bennett's mobilization of it is nevertheless at odds with their project, because their work constantly seeks to diminish the responsibility of humans, not just of individual humans, but of humanity itself, for the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And she does this by, first of all, reducing humans to the status of bit players in the theatre of life, which includes a huge cast of characters of varying scales, from electrons to microbes to corporations and governments. She then defines agency as the power that emerges as a result of the interactions between all the cast members. Individual cast members retain their capacity to disrupt the performance, or even strike off on their own to start something else. But the power of the assemblage as a whole owes entirely to their interactions. So this is the kind of crucial thing that I want to kind of get across about Bennett's model of the assemblage, and it's also present in Delander's model of the assemblage, is the idea that whatever the assemblage is, that it is a product of the interaction between the elements, okay? We could kind of think of this as a sort of fruit salad model of the assemblage, that if you put all the fruit salad ingredients in a bowl and you taste it, the combination of those ingredients is what produces the taste, and the taste will always be an emergent property of the ingredients in the salad bowl. Which sounds fine if we're talking about a salad bowl, but if we then want to describe the classroom as an assemblage, or we want to talk about, you know, apartheid as an assemblage, does it still make the same kind of sense to think of it as in this same way as a fruit salad bowl? Does it just kind of all the things that happen simply emergent properties of the ingredients within? And that is something that I think we need to challenge. So Bennett says, and again I'm quoting, an assemblage owes its agentic capacity to the vitality of the materials that constitute it. She goes on to suggest this vitality is comparable to the Chinese notion of shi, which she defines as vibratory and an elan inherent to the specific arrangement of things. Now, as can be seen, her model of the assemblage is in complete contrast to Deleuze and Guattari's, because it makes no place for the specificities of human desire. And Deleuze and Guattari explicitly rule out the idea that desire can be or should be thought of as an undifferentiated energy like she. But even more importantly, Bennett's formulation is all substance and no form. Bennett does not show any interest in the form taken by assemblages. It's almost as if for her that is irrelevant. All that matters is the vibratory energy of the substances trapped in the net of a particular assemblage. For Bennett, she emanates from the assemblage. It is produced by and projected out of the assemblage as the product of its combined elements. And here I'm quoting from her again. She says, a coffee house or a schoolhouse is a mobile configuration of people, insects, odors, ink, electrical flows, air currents, caffeine tables, chairs, fluids, and sounds. Their she might at one time consist in the mild and ephemeral effluence of good vibes, and at another time in a more dramatic force capable of engendering a philosophical movement or a political movement, as it did in the cafes of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir's Paris, and in the Islamist schools of Pakistan in the late 20th century. Now, when you think about it, this is an astonishing claim. Can one really claim Paris's cafes with the credit Paris's cafes with the invention of existentialism? I mean, did not certain beer halls in Germany also play a part? Not to mention the trains Sartre and others took to get to Germany. However, if we grant that the premise of the thesis is plausible, and I'm pretty skeptical that it is, it actually leaves us none the wiser as to how existentialism came into being in the first place, save that it was the product of some unfathomable alchemy involving people, insects, odors, ink, electrical flows, air currents, caffeine tables, chairs, fluids, and sounds. In other words, what we have is a kind of catalogue of things without any explanation of how those catalogue of things became something more interesting. So if existentialism is the product of the interactions of all these material things, then how did it come into being? How were these elements selected? What power of selection was in operation? What brought the elements together? How did they interact, and what caused them to interact in the ways that they did? And for me, this is how I would understand the idea of complexity, because what we have now is a kind of a litany of things, but we still have a bunch of questions as to how those things have combined and what kind of processes they were able to engender. Moreover, how did these material things, the people, the insects, and so on, combine to give rise to an essentially discursive or expressive entity like existentialism? How did the material capture the immaterial? Now, unfortunately, Bennett doesn't address any of these questions, and in fact, she makes no place for questions of this type, because in her model of the assemblage is always ad hoc and almost exclusively material. She tends to treat the non-material discursive or expressive forms as though they were materials anyway. So ultimately, what Bennett offers isn't so much an explanation of the rise of existentialism in Paris as a highly original starting point for an inquiry, one that takes more seriously than is customarily the case, the actual environment in which existentialism arose. So in other words, I'm not saying that her entire project is worthless, but I am suggesting that it's a starting point rather than an end point. And to me, I think Bennett kind of makes a kind of an amazing start at kind of helping us to think about something like existentialism in a completely new way, but in a sense doesn't really go on with the job. There is no theory there of their organizational structure and so on. So mindful of the time, I'm now going to skip several pages, which if you really are interested, you can find in my book in any case. So I don't feel too bad about skipping these pages, and leap ahead to the second part of what would have been a much longer talk and ask this question. So how should the model of the assemblage be applied? So in other words, if we were confronted with an example like Bennett's of existentialism, of insects and caffeine and so forth in a cafe, how would we apply this model of the assemblage, which, as I've indicated, is essentially a binary model combining assemblages of bodies or formations of bodies with a discursive formation, which very much like Foucault's idea of a discursive formation. So Deleuze and Guattari say that the preferred method would be, in their words, severely restrictive, by which they mean we should first of all seek to determine the specific conditions under which matter becomes material. For example, hang on, I think I might have skipped a little bit too far ahead. Oh, I did skip a little bit too far ahead. My apologies. This editing on the fly is kind of a little bit too crazy. Yeah, okay, so I'm just going to go back a little bit and then I'll come forward to this. So I apologize for that. The example that I'm going to work with is taken from this book here, which was written by a friend of mine, and I highly recommend to you as a really great example of a book that doesn't use Deleuze at all, but nevertheless, I think offers us a very interesting way of thinking about how Deleuze might be used. So this book is essentially about the idea, or one of the things that it's about is public housing, particularly for the Indigenous people in Australia. So public housing, like all forms of infrastructure, is the product of countless small and large decisions by many thousands of people over many decades. And those decisions, however well-intentioned and well thought through, are not made in a vacuum. So of necessity, they are made in a context defined by a set of constraints, which we can think of in terms of internal and external limits, to do with labor, material cost, existing infrastructure, topography, trade agreements, and countless other factors as well. And it is equally possible that they had no such intention, or there was no deliberate intention behind them. And so what I'm kind of interested in then is how do we think about something like housing policy? So now I'm coming back to the bit where I was before. So, for example, how do and under what conditions does matter become material? So how do bricks, timber, steel, and so on become determined as the proper material for housing, as opposed to mud, straw, and wrecked cars, or any other material that would be otherwise deemed unsuited to house building in Australia? And obviously this is not something that would be unfamiliar to anyone in South Africa. You only have to, drive from the old rich white neighborhoods to the townships to see a completely divergent understanding of what qualifies as adequate housing. And for me, that's the question, right? Like, it's not merely that the housing is different, but the fact that they are deemed to be adequate under, quite different sets of conditions. Secondly, we should seek to determine the specific conditions under which semiotic matter becomes expressive. So how is it decided, for example, that a specific arrangement of materials is fitting for a person to live in and some other arrangement is not? And here I must clarify that for Deleuze and Guattari, expression, or what they call becoming expressive, does not simply mean that something has acquired a meaning in the semiotic sense. Rather, it refers to the fact that it has a performative, or what they call a directional function. So it is clear, for example, that in Australia, the word Indigenous has a performative as well as a semiotic function. And indeed, the latter is in all likelihood an epiphenomenon of the former. And as Lee's analyses make apparent, the assemblage, Indigenous housing, is very different in its formulation from what we might think of as regular housing, which a phrase I use for convenience. To conceive of policy as an assemblage then means seeing it in terms of the kinds of arrangements and orderings it makes possible, and even more importantly, the complex and not always fully disclosed set of expectations that it entails. So kind of what I've skipped over and what I want to emphasize here is the assemblage of Indigenous housing is not the tin shack that the Indigenous people live in. Rather, it's almost the common sense idea in Gramsci's sense that this tin shack is somehow perceivable as a house, and it is somehow perceivable as fitting that Aboriginal people should live in that. So the assemblage is fundamentally an idea, but it's a performative idea. And so we have to kind of see the assemblage of materials that constitute the house as the kind of, if you like, the actualization of that idea. But it's not the materials that is the assemblage, it's the idea that constitutes the assemblage. So to see it this way, we need to separate policy as a conceptual entity from its myriad iterations as this or that policy, so infrastructure policy, health policy, transport policy, and so on, but also from a sense of outcomes and outputs. We also have to see so-called policy decisions as components of the policy assemblage and not as some kind of climactic moment in the life of the policy. Policy decisions are part of the form of expression of the policy assemblage, not the content. So by questioning the very idea of policy, Lee enables us to see it in its properly rhizomatic light, if you like. As Lee shows, policymaking takes place in the middle of things, but always pretends otherwise because it is locked in an image of itself as a special type of agency that defines and measures progress. When policy looks at itself, it only sees beginnings and endings, starting points that lack intentionality, in other words, a situation that stands in need of rectification, and finishing points that are fully intended, such as a change situation. In the middle is action, and though policy claims to function as a guide to what happens, it really never claims responsibility. So Lee's ethnography of the debate that went on behind closed doors for the implementation of a large Indigenous housing project offers us a real-world example of what this looks like in action. And so the specific example she gives is a project that was launched in 2009 with considerable fanfare and seemingly bottomless wells of money that was intended to fix long identified problems in Indigenous housing in Northern Australia, with a budget of almost 650 million Australian dollars. So this is 10 years ago, which, to put it into Rand, you can multiply by 10. So it's what 6.5 billion Rand. The program, as it was publicly announced, was intended to provide 750 houses and a refurbishment of a further 2,500 houses for Indigenous people in 73 communities across the Northern Territory. To give you an idea of the scale of this, it needs to be borne in mind that the surface area of the Northern Territory in Australia is twice the size of Texas, and in fact it is bigger than the entire of South Africa, and it is 6 times bigger than Great Britain, but it has a population of only 200,000 people. So to say that it is sparsely populated is an understatement. Outside its 3 main cities, which account for over 1/3 of its population, the small settlements, farms, and communities are defined by their remoteness and isolation. Healthcare is delivered by aeroplane because the distances are so great. They're measured in hours of flying or days of driving rather than kilometers or miles, reflecting the fact that literally nothing is close by. Perhaps unsurprisingly then, given the scale of the Northern Territory, the housing project ran into serious budgetary problems from the very beginning, as original cost estimates proved to be well short of actual costs. This problem was in turn compounded by blatant corruption on the part of white building contractors, who rapidly turned the whole thing into a boondoggle for themselves. It was a public relations disaster, as you can imagine, for the government because of the constant rorting of the program, which pushed the unit cost of houses up to the point where urban Australians, i.e. white middle class voting Australians, began to express resentment at the amount of money being spent on building houses for Black people living in the bush. The build cost of houses in remote Australia is so high that even modest homes are extremely expensive and by implication appear to be luxurious and undeserved to uneducated and urban eyes. So we're talking costing upwards of $1 million to build a single quite modest house, 1,000 kilometers from any metropolitan area, when you could build the same house in the metropolitan area for $300,000 or $400,000. So, people who didn't really know much about life in the bush in Australia began to raise questions about, well, why are these Aboriginal people getting $1 million houses? The blatant undercurrent of racism fueling the outburst of ressentiment against this housing project was all too obvious. But what was less obvious was the way this racism manifested itself in policy discussions. And as Lee documents, racism finds its purest and most baleful expression in ontology. In order to bring down costs and get the whole mess out of the media spotlight, the politicians and the senior bureaucrats charged with fixing things invited the building contractors who had hitherto failed to deliver appropriately costed houses to reconsider the very meaning and actual substance of the concept of the house. And behind closed doors, the builders were told everything is on the table. Okay, so the point that I really want you to pay attention to is this part of the story. So politicians have been told these houses are too expensive, the public won't stand for it. And so the kind of policy people behind closed doors have called all the builders in and said, listen, we can't be spending this much money on houses. We've got to do something about it. We're open to ideas. So with the invitation to put it on the table, the discussion quickly turned to ways of building lower cost houses at speed by lopping off such seemingly discretionary design features as louvered windows and sun hoods, internal flashing for waterproofing, disabled access, and so on. And in the flurry of designing and then undoing the designs for appropriate housing, it was the sound of a built house falling apart in a non-specifiable future that could not compete with the noise of a threatened and defensive government in the here and now. So in other words, the government pushed the builders towards the idea of building a deeply inadequate house in the present so as to meet their present political needs at the expense of a house that was unlikely to last very long at all, and for which the blame would be placed on the Aboriginal people who were living in the house for failing to look after it. So by putting everything on the table, the government gave the builders a free hand to determine not only what constitutes Indigenous housing in the ontological sense, thus redefining its internal limits, but also what constitutes an appropriate dwelling for an Indigenous person in an actual material sense, thus redefining its external limits. But as Lee asks, is a house still a house if, as was so often the case with the houses built in this program, it isn't connected to water? Is a house still a house if it doesn't have adequate temperature control or any means of cooling it down in year-round hot weather, which we get in Northern Australia, and obviously you would know very well in South Africa too? Is it still a house if the sewage pipes are not connected to a sewage system? And these are the internal and external limits of the housing assemblage under normal circumstances. So the assemblage question is, according to what criteria then, is it acceptable and legitimate to not only build houses of this materially substandard variety, but also to expect the intended occupants not only live in them, but express gratitude for the privilege? Now, this question cannot be answered unless we look further afield than the materials themselves. And Lee uses the actual materiality of the matter in the most literal and granular sense in a dialectical fashion to expose the fault lines in the expressive dimension. So by examining in detail the physical and chemical properties of water, for example, and its implications for building houses in tropical locations. So the Northern Territory's climate would be very similar to Durban, for example. She exposes the critical shallowness of policy thinking, which is more focused on ticking boxes than it is in creating endurable living houses in the material sphere. And there are two separate processes at work here. On the one hand, there is a set of questions about what constitutes a house in a material semiotic sense, which corresponds to what I'm calling the internal limit of the assemblage. On the other hand, there is a set of questions about what constitutes an appropriate dwelling in an ethico-political sense, which corresponds to the external limit of the assemblage. By looking at the house in this way as an assemblage that is the product of a highly specific set of choices and decisions, our attention is directed in a very particular way, because it asks us to reverse the usual way of seeing material. Material isn't, on this view of things, merely a condition of possibility, as it tends to be in most so-called new materialist accounts. Rather, it is anything which can be interpolated and accommodated by the expressive sphere. So Deleuze and Guattari say material must always be produced, it doesn't simply exist. We have to resist the empiricist tendency to treat material as given and instead ask the more properly transcendental empiricist question, how and under what conditions does matter become material? In an Australian context, bricks, timber, pressed iron, and fiberboard all seem like proper materials for house building, whereas mud, straw, bark, plastic bottles, and car bodies do not. But in fact, there is no intrinsic reason why these other materials should be excluded. And at various times in Australia's colonial history, houses made from mud, straw, and bark and roughly hewn trees were regarded by the country's European settlers as perfectly fine, albeit provisional modes of housing. Indeed, they were seen as distinctly above the accommodation of Indigenous people deemed suitable to their own needs. Now, though, such constructions are deemed archaic, unsuited to the needs of contemporary existence. In this way, matter is made to bear the weight of history and the myth of progress. And Deleuze and Guattari's question is, what are the limits to what can and cannot be counted as material for a particular assemblage, and how are these limits decided? The implication is that one cannot look to the material itself to find the answer. Instead, one has to examine the assemblage as a whole. What are its requirements? What expectations does it create? What are the tensions internal to it? This in turn leads us to the external limit and the role of history itself and the way it shapes what can and cannot become the proper material of an assemblage. Now, the issue is less what material is suitable for house building and more what material is fitting, where fitting is an ethico-political judgment about what kinds of houses people ought to live in. These two formalizations are arbitrary and mobile and can be seen in the fact that both vary considerably from country to country, and more especially from one class perspective to another. The modest suburban home is a mansion to the slum dweller, and the slum dweller's shanty is a mansion to the rough sleeper, who spends their nights huddled in cardboard lean-tos. By the same token, the suburban home is fitting for a middle-class white person, just as the shanty is, in the eyes of the same middle-class white person, fitting for a poor person, particularly one living in a remote part of the country where they are literally out of sight and out of mind. Formalization means there is a unity of composition, or to put it another way, there is an underlying principle of inclusion and exclusion. But the principle of inclusion and exclusion for one dimension, namely content, can and often is in conflict with the principle of inclusion and exclusion for the other dimension, namely expression. But what is of central importance, and the reason why the assemblage is, in my view, such a powerful concept, is the question of what it takes to bring these two dimensions together in the first place. And this is what the assemblage does. We have to stop thinking of the concept of the assemblage as a way of describing a thing or a situation, and instead see it for what it was always intended to be, namely as a way of analyzing a situation. So faced with any apparent assemblage, we should ask, what holds it together? What are its limits? And what function does it fulfill? Thank you. I'll stop there so that there can be time for questions.
Ian, thank you so much. That was massive, rich. And one of the things that I'm just going to jump in there and just respond and say, one of the things I really, really like about the concept of an assemblage is bringing philosophy back into discourses about social life, social policy, that kind of thing. That, I mean, it's very much it's not just that things are collected together and something happens and then you look at it, but you actually are responsible for producing a situation. And then that responsibility, as you said, that kind of ethico-political responsibility is part of the discussion. So at least there is a role, I think, for philosophers within this domain. So I'm very pleased to pleased to hear that.
We're not irrelevant.
We're not irrelevant. Yes. Okay, so thank you very, very much for that. What I would like to do is just open up the space for questions, and then you can either post them in the chat session or somehow raise your hand or turn on your video and make yourself kind of audible or visible to us. But I think what I'll do is start with Jean. Oh, hi, good. Hi, Jean. Would you like to just speak to your question?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Ian. That was really, really interesting. My own background is in complexity theory, which obviously means many things to many people in the same way that assemblage theory does. So I won't go into my particular take on that, but what I was kind of interested in, and just trying to kind of link with what you were saying, and then a kind of question at the end of this. So I think what you were saying about Bennett's work, which I don't know, is what I feel people do with emergence and self-organization sometimes in complexity theory, which is they see it sort of coming out of a soup of indiscriminate bits, you know, that are kind of connected together, a bit like Smith's invisible hand. That probably wasn't quite what Smith meant, but it kind of underpins neoliberalism as well. It's like, you know, the soup of competition means that good will happen in some sense. And I think what you're describing is what I try and discuss about emergence and self-organization in complexity, is that it's historically and contextually shaped. So you're dealing with with bits that have already got established, patterns that have already got established, which are then interacting in the milieu of the minutiae. In the same way that you can't talk about, I love your example of existentialism, you know, you can't talk about that without talking about Sartre and de Beauvoir, but the fact they did that in a cafe after having gone to see Heidegger, and maybe Merleau-Ponty walked in, and, you know, it was just at the moment when this happened in the cafe, is all relevant to how those kind of ideas emerge. So I love that, and I love the way you were kind of describing the way that the material and the policy, people's ideas, all that kind of cultural stuff co-evolve and interplay, that we can't talk about, you know, bricks without talking about policy and the way people view certain aspects of society. So that kind of co-evolving of inner and outer, and how it hardens into policy, it hardens into bricks, and then things happen. What I wasn't quite clear about was in terms of do you then, in assemblage theory, in a sense, deconstruct it back into the kind of, you know, the hard and the soft, the policy and the building? Is there a kind of then a deconstruction back into bits? As opposed to the lovely description you gave of how they co-evolve, that we, you know, that policy has got bricks in it in the way that bricks have got policy in them. So I wondered if you could just say a bit more about the end bit of what you do then in terms of analysing what's there.
Yeah, look, so partly I have to give a fairly disappointing answer in that there is no sort of fully formed methodology, so nobody really knows exactly how we should do this, and so that's kind of been one of the reasons why I've been interested in it, precisely to try to answer that question. The second thing I would say is that it's probably I wasn't saying that they co-evolve, rather it's like the sphere of the expressive or the discursive and the material are in sort of, you know, old Althusserian terms, semi-autonomous, and it's a question of sometimes one mode of discourse can capture a set of materials, or likewise a set of materials can become attached to a specific set of discursive ideas. So in our other research that I've been working with a different research team, for example, I mean, we've been focusing on just like the image of cycling and people riding their bikes and how they think about that. And what's really interesting about that is that like everybody knows, having been to Amsterdam or Copenhagen, everybody knows exactly what we would need to do in order to increase cycling in any city anywhere in the world. Like the material side of it is completely well known. And so what's interesting is the kind of discursive resistance to that, all the different ways by which governments seem to be able to, on the one hand, know what to do, and on the other hand, have a perfectly, you know, valid set of reasons why they shouldn't kind of do it. And so what we're interested in is the ways by which different kinds of discourses get taken up or don't get taken up. And in the case of cycling, what's really interesting is the way that cycling in Australia, for example, has been progressively positioned as a leisure activity, but it has been also shifted away from being a mode of transport. So it's actually quite hard in Australia to get policy put forward that sees cycling as transport, but easy to get policy put forward that sees it as leisure. So you can get bike paths and you can get BMX parks and whatever, but what you can't get is dedicated bike lanes on the freeway to enable bikes to do it. So they're the discursive capture of bike equals leisure versus bike equals transport completely changes how the material is dealt with. So it's not co-evolution in that sense. It's much more kind of complex than that. And we can't really track it to a sort of an emergence idea either.
Can I just come back on that? It
Sure.
might be we're not we're not understanding the same thing by co-evolution. So I'm not seeing that as a kind of micro soup idea again. It's just that in the context of a particular policy, what happens next to the bike is impacted by that. So there's a clunkiness about that process, but it interrelates. So there's a good example by Giels that you may know of, looking at the evolution of the car industry and talking about why we ended up with petrol cars, not electric cars, and how all the kind of policy interplayed with the infrastructure there. So I just don't want you to hear the co-evolutionary idea as kind of being a kind of micro ramping up, but more that sometimes, you know, politics has the power in what's going to happen next. Sometimes economics does, sometimes technology does, but they do interplay, even though they're not always equal at different points of time. So I hope that makes sense.
Oh yeah, sure, of course.
So, but I'm agreeing with you, I think. But I think that is a kind of sort of co-evolutionary process. So,
right.
Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Jean. Anyone else want to kind of weigh in? So, okay, while you're thinking about it, one of the things I'm kind of interested in is back to our earlier conversation.
I think Glenn wanted to ask a question then.
Sorry, what was this?
Was Glenn just kind of zooming in? Or?
Sorry, you know, I'm kind of, Glenn, thank you.
No, Ian, it's fine. You can let Andrea go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Glenn. I've actually...
Well, I'm totally out of my depth here, really, with this talk, Ian, but I was very curious if you wouldn't mind elaborating for me a little bit more on why you rejected the idea of assemblage theory as arrangement or ensemble. And I was struck that you used the example of an arrangement of a meeting between people as one of the reasons. And I suppose I was thinking again, as you know, my field is music, about ensemble as a collection of musicians coming with different instruments together. And I was struck from your talk that it's the idea which is the assemblage, not the actual manifestation of the collection of things which have come together. So I was just keen to know if you wouldn't mind elaborating for me a bit more, because I haven't read the scholar Bennett that you critique, but why is ensemble or arrangement definitely not a concept which could be used in this philosophical interpretation of assemblage?
Oh, yeah, so I definitely do think arrangement should be used, but ensemble is problematic. I suppose the problem with ensemble as an idea is that it's quite unitary. Like, we tend to think of an ensemble of musicians as being defined by a very specific number of musicians that are in that ensemble working together and so on. Whereas, like, for me, and I actually use this in the book, I think the idea of arrangement within a musical context actually is a very good way of thinking about the assemblage. Like I had, when I was a student, I was a terrible music student, but I had a guitar teacher who could, like, you know, more or less instantly transpose and take a song that he'd heard on, you know, being played on the flute and then rearrange and play it on the guitar. And I always found those kinds of capacities to arrange and to rearrange music very, very interesting. And the reason why it fits with the idea of the assemblage is, if you ask the question, what is the limit of the arrangement of a song before, or a piece of music, before it ceases to be recognizable as that piece of music, is like the internal limit of the arrangement, but also the internal limit of the assemblage. So that there is a limit, and Deleuze and Guattari talk about this quite specifically. There is a limit to the variation. But what is also important is that means that variation is inherent to the idea itself. And then there is an external limit, in the sense that there's a kind of, I don't know, like a tolerance for that people would have for that variation. Like you can vary the arrangement only so much before people think that really sounds awful. Like, you know, you start using pots and pans instead of, you know, drums, and people are like, and that would be the external limit. So I've always thought that music and the idea of arrangement within music offers an excellent way to think about the idea of the assemblage. And if you go back to my example of housing, then you see exactly that kind of thing. Like we can vary the materials of the house, and that's the internal limit. And the external limit is, well, what are we prepared to stand for? And, you know, like there's that fantastic Facebook meme, and this will be dear to Andrea's heart, that camping is for people to spend lots of money so they can live like homeless people. Which is like, you know, this is the variation on the idea of what we are prepared to stand for and what we were prepared to describe as fitting as our way of living.
I have to
Thanks, Ian.
there and just give some background to that Ian came to visit South Africa and has been traumatized by being taken on a hike and will not let me forget that. Okay, I'm afraid I don't have a full kind of screen of people here. So if you would like to comment or weigh in, just somehow, I don't know, turn your video on or make a noise. And
well, there's also, you can raise your hand function on Zoom as well.
Yes, that too. Okay, well, again, sorry if I'm jumping in there, but and I know this is probably a left ball question or whatever, but back to our conversation right before we even started the seminar, is assemblage theory helpful in any way about trying to negotiate the anti-vax issue?
Well, I have been thinking about this kind of a lot. Well, we have someone who wants to ask a basic question. I'm going to take the easy question first.
Okay.
Come back to that question.
Yes, Rachel, go ahead. Thank you.
Hi, Ian, thank you very much. Sorry, please excuse the noise in the background. It's building, actually. Like Glenn, I also feel a bit out of my depth, but I want to just understand the basic idea of the assemblage more. And when is it helpful? Like, I don't know, I come from visual studies background where, you know, when you pick up a lens to analyze a work, there's usually a reason you're looking at that work through that lens to try to show something specific. So what does assemblage theory sort of help us to see, as opposed to looking at matter in other ways, or what's its value to you?
So, I mean, one version of assemblage theory has been enormously kind of popular and influential within visual studies, for sure. And my best guess is that the choice of the term assemblage as a translation actually comes from art anyway, from the sort of assemblage show that was held in New York in 1960 or whatever. And so that's I think, a clear connection there. So, for example, I wrote a paper some time ago about Francis Bacon's studio, and so as you may know, when he died, his studio, which was actually in London, was in a house that he didn't own, and so in a fairly complicated way, the studio was bequeathed to his partner, who in turn donated it to a museum in Dublin. And so this studio was kind of cut out of the house. Like they took the kind of walls down and everything, and they employed like 20 archaeologists, which is quite amazing, to just transport this whole museum and this whole studio and reconstruct it in a museum in Dublin. And you can actually go there now and see it, and they've done cutaway slides and everything, so you can sort of see, because Bacon was quite famous for just, he never threw anything away in his studio, just let everything pile up and so forth. And so somebody wrote an essay about the kind of trying to see if there was a correlation between the mess in his studio and what you saw on his paintings and so forth. And I always found that quite fascinating as an idea, like to try to think about the relationship between the material space in which the artist was working and the resulting kind of work. so I kind of got interested in Bacon from that point of view. And then when you start to think about his paintings, and you sort of think, well, there's a sort of the material dimension to it, obviously, and the fact that he always painted on the reverse side of the canvas, and the way he uses those paints. But those are all kinds of choices that are not simply artistic choices, but they're also like material choices. And then the question coming from the other side, which is, well, what ways of thinking about the world, ways of seeing the world actually enable these ways of moving with visual materials in order to construct a certain kind of image? And in Deleuze's book on Bacon, he argues that we can't understand Bacon's work unless we sort of see it as being in conversation with photography. So he sort of says, you know, Bacon obviously recognized that the idea of the figurative painting is in some senses completely defeated by the photograph, because a photograph can do, you know, reproduce images far more successfully than a painter can. But then that doesn't mean we should give up on figurative painting altogether and just become abstract. So what was the kind of expressive ground left available to the artist? And that's a philosophical problem as much as it is a visual problem. So in my way of thinking, assemblage theory gives you a kind of a dialectical grid, if you like, to begin to talk about that relationship between the material aspects of the painting, but also the visual ideas that were kind of influencing the way those things come together.
Thanks.
Thanks very much. Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking, because Rachel has just set up her studio, so I'm hoping that she's going to be starting to think about her material space in relation to her actual works.
Well, you know, Bacon came to South Africa, and because he had family there, and he said he couldn't paint there because the light was too bright.
Yes, yeah, I think that's yeah. If you are European, South African light is extremely harsh. Aragon, is that the right pronunciation of your name? Would you like to sort of come up and pose your question in voice?
Yeah, make it easy, Aragon.
Hey, how are you?
How are you?
Good. Chantal's probably pretty angry with me now because I had headphones on and now I'm interrupting her very difficult teaching.
We'll give her my regards anyway.
I will. So what I was thinking though is, thinking about a methodology looking at assemblages. For me, it'd be interesting. I mean, I guess one of the parts you could look at would be incorporeal transformations, the idea that semiotic statements can have sort of non-semiotic, non-discursive effects. The judge saying you're guilty is just a speech act, but that speech act has material consequences, obviously, for the person deemed guilty. So for me, that'd be interesting as part of a methodology, because it's the exact moment at which politics can take place, right? You can look at the intersection of those statements and their material results and see how they sort of push assemblages to points of transformation for good and bad, especially when you're looking at statements, incorporeal transformations that can push an assemblage past its external limits, push it into an entirely new assemblage. I was wondering if that might be part of a useful methodology.
Yeah, look, it obviously is, and has been a kind of starting point, the idea of the performative and the idea of the incorporeal transformation. So Aragon is a Deleuze aficionado as well, so he's kind of asking the highly technical question. For the non-aficionados, the idea of the incorporeal transformation goes back to the idea of the performative, which probably is familiar to you from Judith Butler, if not from Austin or Searle, depending on how far back your reading goes in this area. And so the idea of the performative is that it's a class of language that is actually capable of performing an action by virtue of saying the thing. So if the judge makes the sentence, sentence you to life imprisonment or whatever, the actual act takes place via speech. And so Judith Butler extended this idea to say, for example, that gender itself is a kind of performative, in that the kind of classifying someone as male or female occurs by virtue of speech, but it has lasting material effects for that person's entire life. So Deleuze and Guattari are very much interested in this idea, and one version of the way they think about the idea of the assemblage is that the expressive dimension functions in this way as an incorporeal transformation, and it goes back to the Stoic idea of the attributes, that the body plus its attributes, the attributes are something that is attached to the body, so semiotic signs are attached to the body, but they don't change the body in any material way. So yeah, so clearly the idea of the incorporeal transformation would be one part of what's interesting about the assemblage. But what I have found is that it's actually a fairly limiting starting point, because there are lots of situations. So for example, this will be relevant to Chantal if she's listening. I have been writing a paper recently about the idea of doing an Ironman, for example, which is an insane triathlon. And so my question is, when does the incorporeal transformation of doing an Ironman take place? Does it take place as you cross the finish line and there's somebody there shouting, "You are an Ironman," and you feel really great having done this crazy thing, and now you're an Ironman? Or does it take place much, much earlier than that, at the moment when you kind of decide that you really want to do this crazy thing? And therefore you have already kind of entered into a process of transformation. So I found that once you really start to think about the idea of the incorporeal transformation, it's much less obvious how it should be applied than it first meets the eye. It's very easy to say, oh yes, the judge's sentence, that's the moment of transformation. But is it really? I mean, is that the moment? Like, do people kind of accidentally become criminals, or do they kind of enter into a sort of criminal circumstance long before the moment that they end up receiving the judge's sentence? And so some other processes were involved. So I don't have an answer to this question right now, but I have begun to realize that we need to think even more about how we might use this idea of the incorporeal transformation in order to begin to incorporate it into assemblage theory more generally.
Okay, we are, I'm afraid, already.
I dodged the hard question. Well done, me.
You dodged the anti-vax question. That's okay. I think that's something that would be very interesting to kind of take up and talk about in a future occasion. So it's not particularly when we can remove Ian from the penal colony and actually when you are allowed again to travel and not become a prisoner in your country, then we'll take up those kinds of conversations again. So I want to say very, very much thank you for joining us for this tiny, short little time. It shot by. And yes, hopefully we will be in contact again. And thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful weekend. Maybe if you want...
and lovely to see familiar faces.
Yeah, maybe turn on your video, sort of say goodbye, and enjoy your Friday evening.
And I look forward to your thesis, Anton. Perhaps you can help explain my brother.
We need to be able to.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Hi, Eddie.
Glenn,
Oh,
nice
nice to see you. Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks again, Ian. It was fantastic.
Thank you. You're very welcome.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Andrea.
Thank you.
Look after yourself.
Yes.
Stay well.
Thank you. You too. Bye.